You're in the middle of a conversation in your second language. Everything's flowing. You're feeling good. And then, blank. The word you need just vanishes. You know it, but it's gone.
And that panic sets in, right? Your mind starts racing, you freeze up, and suddenly the whole conversation derails. But here's the thing. This isn't actually a vocabulary problem. It's a retrieval problem, and there's some fascinating neuroscience behind why it happens.
Which means we can hack it. If we understand the mechanism, we can build systems to work around it. And that's exactly what we're doing today, breaking down what the top language learners and polyglots actually do when their brain goes blank.
We're going to look at 3 specific strategies that sound counterintuitive at first. Like, did you know that using filler words is actually a sign of fluency, not weakness? Or that describing something you can't name can make you sound more fluent than if you just said the word.
And we're not just talking theory here. I've been testing these techniques myself over the past few weeks, and the results have been, let's just say I wish I'd known this stuff years ago. Emma's going to walk us through the science, and I'm going to show you exactly how to implement it.
Plus, we've got a training method at the end that uses time pressure to actually rewire how fast your brain retrieves words. It's based on research from fluency training, and it's surprisingly simple to do at home.
So if you've ever felt like your brain betrayed you mid-sentence, or you've avoided speaking practice because you're afraid of freezing up, this episode is your playbook. Let's break down the science of the blank mind and turn it into something you can actually use. We've all been there. You're speaking a foreign language, everything's going fine, and then suddenly, nothing. Complete blank. The word you need just vanishes. But here's what fascinates me. It's not actually gone. Your brain hasn't deleted it. So what's happening in that moment?
This is where the neuroscience gets really interesting. There's this concept called the affective filter hypothesis, developed by linguist Stephen Krashen, and it's basically describing a mental gatekeeper. When you're anxious or stressed, variables like fear, low motivation, or lack of confidence literally create a barrier that prevents language input from reaching the part of your brain that processes language acquisition.
Wait, so you're saying anxiety isn't just making it harder to think? It's actually blocking access to information that's already in there?
Precisely. And there's a biological mechanism behind this. When you're stressed, like when you're worried about being judged for your accent or making mistakes, which research shows is incredibly common among language learners, your body releases cortisol. That stress hormone specifically impairs your hippocampus, which is the brain region responsible for retrieving information from long-term memory.
So cortisol is essentially jamming the retrieval system. The memory is stored, but the stress response is preventing you from accessing it. That's actually kind of infuriating when you think about it, right? And here's where it gets even more complex. Even without the stress component, your brain is dealing with what researchers call between-language competition. Your native language isn't just sitting quietly in the background, it's actively inhibiting your second language. Think of it like 2 radio stations trying to broadcast on similar frequencies. The stronger signal, your native language, interferes with the weaker one. That explains why sometimes the wrong language pops out. I've had moments learning Spanish where I'd blank on a word, and suddenly a French word I learned years ago would appear instead. My brain's just grabbing whatever foreign language file it can access first.
Yes, and this ties into what's called the tip of the tongue phenomenon, TOT for short. In second language acquisition, this happens when you know the word, you can almost feel it, but you can't quite produce it. What's fascinating is that forgetting in a second language is usually a retrieval failure, not a memory loss. The information hasn't disappeared, your brain just can't locate it in that moment because of the interference.
So we're dealing with 3 simultaneous problems: the affective filter blocking input, cortisol disrupting retrieval, and native language interference creating noise in the system. No wonder people freeze up.
And the cruel irony is that the more you panic about forgetting, the more cortisol you produce, which makes retrieval even harder. It becomes a self-reinforcing cycle.
But if we understand the mechanism, if we know it's a retrieval problem, not a knowledge problem, can we hack the system? Can we train ourselves to lower that affective filter or work around the interference?
That's the million-dollar question. Because if the blank mind is a predictable biological response to specific triggers, then theoretically we should be able to design counter-strategies. We need techniques that work with how the brain actually functions under stress, not against it. The solution isn't just study more vocabulary or practice harder. We need to address the retrieval mechanism itself. Find ways to keep that cortisol response from hijacking the system in the first place. So we've established that forgetting words mid-conversation is universal. Now let's get tactical. I want to talk about what I call the stalling system. Basically, how to keep the conversation alive while your brain frantically searches for that missing word. This is where most people panic, right? They hit that blank spot and just freeze. Or worse, they apologize profusely and derail the entire conversation. Yes, and here's the counterintuitive part that I love. Using fillers, those and sounds we've been trained to eliminate, is actually a sign of high-level fluency, not weakness. It's the 80-20 of buying time. Native speakers do this constantly. Wait, hold on, I need to push back on that a bit. Are we really saying and are good? Because I've spent years trying to train those out of my speech patterns. Fair challenge. Let me clarify. There's a hierarchy here. Research shows that fillers serve a critical function. They maintain the flow of conversation and signal to your listener that you're still planning your next move, not finishing your turn. You're essentially holding your speaking slot. But here's where it gets interesting. There are unlexicalized fillers like and then there are lexicalized fillers, actual words like well, actually, I mean. The data indicates that as learners progress in proficiency, they shift toward using more lexicalized fillers, so it's an upgrade path. You're not eliminating fillers, you're sophisticating them. Correct. And this is where the stalling strategy framework comes in. I've tested this extensively in my own language learning, and the key is having a mental toolkit of phrases you can deploy instantly when you hit that word blank moment. These aren't just random sounds, they're strategic communication tools that keep your listener engaged while you reboot. Give me the actual phrases. What should people memorize? Here's what I found works best. Start with acknowledgement phrases. Let me think about that for a second. Or, that's a good question. These buy you 3 to 5 seconds immediately. Then you've got the explicit patience requesters. Bear with me, or thank you for being patient. What's fascinating about these is they actually manage the social pressure of the pause. They lower your anxiety because you've explicitly acknowledged the gap. I love that last point. You're essentially giving yourself permission to pause, and you're bringing your listener into the process rather than making them wonder if you've just stopped talking. Yes, and then there's the meta-commentary layer. What's the word I'm looking for? Or how do I put this? These are incredibly powerful because they transform your struggle into part of the conversation itself. You're not hiding the fact that you're searching. You're making the search visible and acceptable. Acknowledge, request patience, then meta-comment if needed. But here's my question. Doesn't this only work if you actually find the word eventually? What if you're still stuck after using all these phrases? That's where the next strategy comes in. But before we get there, I want people to understand that the stalling system isn't about stalling indefinitely. It's about buying yourself 5 to 10 seconds of cognitive processing time. In my experiments, I found that having these phrases memorized, and I mean truly automatic, no thinking required memorized, reduced my mid-conversation anxiety by what felt like 70% because I knew I had a tool. The confidence factor. You're not afraid of the blank because you have a protocol for handling it. Correct. And here's the implementation step. Pick 3 phrases from what we just discussed. Write them down, practice them out loud 10 times each. Make them muscle memory, because when you're in the moment, fumbling for a word, you won't have the cognitive bandwidth to construct these phrases from scratch. They need to be automatic, so we're essentially creating a buffer system. The phrases are your buffer while your brain does the actual retrieval work in the background. Perfect analogy. And the beauty is, native speakers use these exact same strategies. They just don't think about it consciously. We're making the implicit explicit, then drilling it until it becomes implicit again. But what happens when the stalling runs out and you still don't have the word? That's when things get really interesting, because that's when you need a completely different approach. We've talked about buying time with filler phrases, but what happens when you've bought yourself 3 seconds and you still don't have the word? That's where the real magic happens. This is where most people panic and just give up. They'll say, never mind, or switch to their native language. But there's a much better strategy, one that actually makes you sound more fluent, not less. It's called circumlocution, and it's basically the art of describing what you can't name. I love this because it's technically a communication strategy in linguistics. Researchers call it a core component of strategic competence. But in practice, it's just turning a vocabulary gap into a descriptive game. And here's the thing, native speakers do this all the time too. Like when you can't remember someone's name at a party, so you say, you know the tall guy with the beard who works in marketing? That's circumlocution. You're using what you do know to point toward what you're trying to say. The research defines it as using descriptions, explanations, or definitions to express a concept when the specific word is missing. But let's make this concrete. Alex, give us the balcony example. Perfect example. So imagine you're trying to describe a balcony, but you can't remember the word. Most people would just freeze. But if you understand the system, you'd say something like, it's like a terrace, but smaller. It's rectangular, comes out from a door, and it's the outside space you have in an apartment building. And boom, the other person immediately knows what you mean. They might even jump in and say, oh, you mean a balcony? Which brings up something fascinating from the research. Successful communication is often collaborative. The listener helps you find the word. That's the part people don't realize. You're not failing when you use circumlocution. You're actually engaging the other person in co-constructing meaning. It's more interactive, more human. But here's where I've optimized this. I've broken it down into what I call the minimum effective description framework. Of course you have a framework for this. Function, location, appearance. In that order. Function is always first because it's the most distinctive. Walk me through an example. Let's say you can't remember the word tent. Function, it's a temporary shelter for camping. Location, you set it outdoors, usually in nature. Appearance, it has poles and a roof light covering. The research actually uses this exact example. They call it a makeshift house used for camping with poles and a roof for shelter. And boom, the other person immediately knows what you mean. They might even jump in and say, oh, you mean a balcony?
Which brings up something fascinating from the research. Successful communication is often collaborative. The listener helps you find the word. That's the part people don't realize. You're not failing when you use circumlocution. You're actually engaging the other person in co-constructing meaning. It's more interactive, more human. But here's where I've optimized this. I've broken it down into what I call the minimum effective description framework. Of course you have a framework for this. Function, location, appearance. In that order. Function is always first because it's the most distinctive. Walk me through an example. Let's say you can't remember the word tent. Function, it's a temporary shelter for camping. Location, you set it outdoors, usually in nature. Appearance, it has poles and a roof light covering. The research actually uses this exact example. They call it a makeshift house used for camping with poles and a roof for shelter. And boom, the other person immediately knows what you mean. They might even jump in and say, oh, you mean a balcony? Which brings up something fascinating from the research. Successful communication is often collaborative. The listener helps you find the word. That's the part people don't realize. You're not failing when you use circumlocution. You're actually engaging the other person in co-constructing meaning. It's more